Hello, and welcome back to the latest episode of the Short Term Rentals podcast, now on episode 6. My name is Paul Stevens, news editor of Short Term Rentals, and today I'm speaking to Jesse DePinto, who is co-founder and chief product officer at Frontdesk, which is a short-term rental apartment startup based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Hi, Jesse, how are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm doing well. Happy to be on here. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you on as well. So today, as you know, we're going to be talking about Frontdesk's recent funding round of $6.8 million and what it means, the long-term viability of the master lease model, and also optimism for when bookings may start to pick up again post-pandemic. So, Jesse, my first question is, how has Frontdesk been affected by the COVID-19 outbreak, and how difficult was it for you to organise your recent funding round amid all of the global lockdown?
In short, it's changed a lot about our business. I'll hit on the second point first. So our funding round, we just closed our Series A, $6.8 million of a combination of equity and debt. And we're very excited about that. Candidly, this has been in the works for the past couple months. So a lot of it was already committed and closed before COVID broke out. But when the virus did start to spread, it did change the plans. And in short, we increased the amount that we needed to raise. Clearly, we were in the middle of a funding round, and we realized that not only would we benefit from having more cash and more runway on a defensive side, but we also realized there's potentially going to be a lot of offensive type of opportunities that might present themselves along the way. So we raised more than we set out to raise, and thanks to the overwhelming support of our existing investors, we were able to successfully raise. But to answer your first question, it's not all great news. It's, our bookings took a major hit. I think April at its worst was when it was at its worst in the United States, where we primarily operate. Our bookings were down 60%, and that was the worst. And it's getting better, it appears. But when your business takes such a hit like that, you just can't put your head in the sand and pretend that everything's going to be better. So we ended up, unfortunately and sadly, having to part ways with about 16% of our workforce, about 35 employees, ranging from cleaners to marketers. So we had to make some major decisions. We had to reposition. We would have had to cut a lot more if our team wasn't so, and our employees weren't so dedicated and able to be repositioned. So we had to reposition a fair amount of our workforce off of pure growth efforts and more toward revenue generation and sustainability efforts, not unlike what some of our peers have gone through. So it's been a major change. Both there's some highlights, some lowlights, but overall it's entirely different than what we mapped out 2020 to look like, in some good ways and some bad.
Thank you. So for the next question, I wanted to touch on what your opinion was on the master lease model, and how viable do you think it is for the future? We've seen the likes of Stay Alfred, for example, in recent weeks. How do you think it will change the way companies view balancing profitability with sustainable growth from now on?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a major shift away from master lease model in the short-term rental space post-COVID. We're already seeing that in a major way. Zeus, for example, I would put in the short-term rental category, was publicly saying they're negotiating every single one of their leases and converting them into revenue sharing agreements. We're hearing the same thing from all of our competitors and friends across the country, and we're doing the same as well. So there is a renewed emphasis on sustainability and revenue sharing type of models. Though I wouldn't say the master lease model is necessarily dead. I think people may overcorrect in this period, and and shift entirely away from it. But the master lease model still serves a very good purpose if done right. So paying 20% over market rate rent and signing 5 to 10 year master lease contracts is potentially not the right way to do it. But if you're more conservative with your master leasing approach, and it all depends on, that's just one of the many terms in the agreement structure. So I certainly think there's a path forward on master leasing, but obviously we're seeing the negative side effects. Yes, stay off red. Lyric is another that from what we can see, they're down to one property. From previously being somewhere around 400 or 500 units. So there's definitely a contraction happening, but there's also other operators are growing right now, and they're continuing to grow their revenue sharing business. I think a lot of us in the industry saw the writings on the wall post WeWork, and that was really a good trigger point to force a conversation in the boardrooms across all of the startups to say, maybe we should start looking at worst case scenarios here. Nobody was expecting this type of black swan event, but I think a handful of people maybe expected some kind of recession around 2020, 2021. So a lot of us were already preparing for this and starting to convert our leases over to revenue sharing leases. The problem is some competitors, some of the larger ones specifically, had been signing such long commitments that they were too far in the master leasing model at the very high risk side of it. It's a lot harder to go backwards when you've already gone so far forwards so aggressively. So that those more growth at all costs type of startups in the space are seeing a lot more friction when it comes to renegotiating their leases. Most of our leases are 12 months, so it's a lot easier to reopen the lease at renewal time and take a look at how we need to shift things. It's a lot harder when it's a 5-year lease lease commitment. So I think the master lease model will exist, and just in a much different format. I mean, one thing, for example, is we're hearing from some other peers, international peers, who are doing some type of hybrid model that seems to be taking root, where it's a revenue sharing, but there's some kind of minimum guaranteed rent. Maybe it's 50% minimum guaranteed rent, and it's enough for the landlords and the owners to get comfortable with it, but it's also enough for the operator to not get completely squeezed when and if travel dries up again. So there's that. There are ways that you can structure it so that it's effectively master lease, but with added commission. We'll see definitely creative destruction happening mostly in the lease agreements in this field. I think the product will remain very similar, maybe more on the longer term side of the house, but the agreement structures will look very different post-COVID, would be my prediction if I had to guess.
And also looking ahead, how, in another interest, how would you say, how optimistic are you for the future of travel? And is there any indication you're getting for when bookings might be picking up again?
Yeah, we're obviously it varies by market. Everything that that's talked about in the industry, there seems to be pretty widely known consensus about the types of travel that are going to rebound first. Obviously, drive-to markets, more traditional vacation destinations, rural areas where you can spread out a little bit more, kind of that shifting away from the tier ones and the more traditional tourist destinations, as Brian Chesky calls it, the great redistribution of travel. I certainly believe and buy into all of those trends and predictions. Also, as you might expect, there's consensus among the business travel rebounding slower than leisure. Certainly any kind of convention traffic and travel for conventions and international is going to be much slower to rebound. in terms of travel, I have two reasons to be kind of hopeful right now. One is just on the pure short term. Let's call it one night to 2 weeks at a time. That is starting to pick up again. So just as of the past week, we've seen an incredible bounce back. I think the pent up demand is starting to, at least in the United States, people are starting to get stir crazy, and maybe they're traveling for not good reasons, but other times maybe they're traveling to see family. We tend to get a lot of people traveling for family reasons, both good and bad type of family events, along with the obvious healthcare professionals and frontline workers. But so there's a little reason for optimism on the short term market, but there's also a reason to be optimistic about the long term or the midterm stays. So there's a lot of attention right now on, is midterm the new short term, or Airbnb transforming into a real estate company of doing more monthly stays rather than short term stays. I certainly believe a lot of that is due to COVID, and Airbnb, Sonder, Frontdesk, and all the other short-term companies in the industry are doing that for means of survival today. But I do think that as with many periods of turbulent change, mostly in economic recessions, there are habits that are formed with consumers. So people are learning now that they can go to Airbnb to search for a furnished apartment for 6 months that may be the same cost as on a monthly basis as a 12-month lease in an unfurnished apartment. So they just the pricing happens to work out today, and the calendar availability happens to work out today, where these more long-term shoppers and more residents and tenants of typically apartment buildings are seeking out different channels for their stay, especially today while the world is so uncertain. Half the world and half the country doesn't know if they're still going to have a job at the end of this, or whether school's going to be canceled for the next semester. So the big question is, do I move in with mom and dad for a few months until I figure out whether my college is going to start in the fall, or do I get kind of a short-term temporary apartment? So we're getting a lot of, I think, demand and eyeballs shifting away from the traditional apartments.com, Zillow, apartment listing sites, and moving on to more of these short-term sites like Airbnb, and potentially HomeAway or some VRBO or some of the direct channels. So that obviously is going to, once travel recovers, those prices are going to get priced. We're going to start pricing people out of those markets. But consumers are still going to have the Airbnb app downloaded on their phone, for example, and they're still going to realize that Airbnb is a good place to check first next time they're looking for a monthly stay, or even potentially replacing their 12-month leases with monthly stays. So, for us, we've gone from a 3-night average length of stay to about a 20-night average length of stay. And while that's heavily influenced by the coronavirus right now, I do believe that when things stabilize and short-term travel rebounds, that we may hover somewhere closer to 10 nights of an average stay length, because that market is just shifting. The analogy I like to give is we're looking at the difference between people who use Uber and Lyft, who own a car versus don't own a car. I think in a similar way, people that use short-term rentals and Airbnb today already have a place to live. They're using these short-term accommodations to stay. Whereas what we're seeing in the transportation market is people are getting so accustomed to these on-demand transportation apps like Uber and Lyft that they ditch their car because they realize it's actually cheaper for them just to never own a car, never pay for maintenance, gas. And in the same way, apartment living and even owning a house, you pay the cable, you pay for furniture, upkeep, utilities. In some cases, it may actually be economically prudent to stay in short-term apartments and ditching the concept of a 12-month lease, especially if your job is inclined to to lots of travel, or your behavior is you enjoy traveling in your free time. The thing that's, I think, going to accelerate that trend is the work from home movement. I like the expression that I've picked up on online, that when work from home turns into work from anywhere, then would people still be stuck with a 12-month lease? I think humans are more wired to want to roam, and the only reason they stay put is based on principles laid before us in agricultural and industrial revolutions, where we have a reason to be tethered. But if you take away the concept of coming into an office, and you take away the concept of having to sign a 12-month lease or buy a home somewhere to live, then the world is your oyster to roam as you feel free. So that's more, I guess, just theory at this point. Nobody knows how that's going to shake out, but I do believe there's a number of trends that, if the digital nomad market and concept was to go mainstream, that this would be the trigger point, the coronavirus outbreak here, to push that mainstream. So we're really redefining what it means for travel. So hence the long-winded answer to your question of optimism for travel. It depends on how what lens you view travel through. But there is reason to be hopeful on both sides.
Well, we always need a bit of optimism. And I mean, with my last question, it's something that we're asking a lot of people within the industry right now. And that regards, what do you kind of envisage with what the future normal might look like in the post-COVID-19 short-term rental multifamily space, and what that's going to look like, essentially?
Yeah, I think, obviously I already kind of went down that path in terms of the future normal. But the thing I didn't get a chance to touch on is the increasing need for standardization. Hotels have a leg up here, where they are able to enforce certain levels of cleanliness, and short-term rental hosts, Airbnb hosts, all types of vacation rental hosts have not been known for consistency in their cleaning. So there's a need for standardization, especially on the cleaning front right now. And I think Airbnb is doing a good job here pushing those standards with the badge that you can get for opting into their I think it's called the buffer that they have, where you can have a day in between stays, up to 3 days, just to be sure in some cases. So I think the OTAs are taking a bit of a role in terms of enforcing standardization. But there's another aspect of standardization that I think is only going to get more important, which is the need for safety and security standards. So we saw kind of toward the last half of 2019, the ugly side of short-term rentals, and not enforcing certain criminal screening or ID verification or other type of fraud detection policies. The OTAs have really stepped it up since then, but I think more needs to be done. And I think that there's, especially when you're talking multifamily, where what I call mixed use apartments, mixed use communities, where there are long-term residents sharing the same walls, entryways, and building access as short-term rental guests, there is an increased need to ensure safety and security standards are followed, to ensure that you're not keeping the same code on your lockbox for a month at a time. Make sure that if it's an apartment community and long-term residents are being screened, criminal background screens to be part of that community, that the short-term rental guests are held to the same standards. So that is less related to coronavirus. I just think the timing has happened, and it was already on the verge. So I definitely think the increase of standardization is needed, and between the OTAs and the property managers and brands like Frontdesk and our peers need, as an industry, to push that level of standardization, both for the assurance of guests who are looking to book a short-term rental over a traditional hotel accommodation, but also for the comfort and security of the long-term residential communities that many of these short-term rentals are operating within. I think will be important to rebound from this.
Well, that concludes all of my questions. So thank you very much for talking to me today, Jesse, and for being our latest guest on the podcast.
Absolutely, Paul. Happy to be here and a big fan. I'll be continuing to follow your stories. Thank you for everything you do for the industry as well.
Thank you very much. And just a reminder as well to everyone listening that you can follow all of the latest news, features and opinions from the global short-term rental industry on ShortTermRentalz.com, where you can also sign up to our weekly newsletters, which come out every Monday and now Thursday. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.